My next guest says at some point South Africans are going to have to take a hard look at themselves and take responsibility for having allowed political leaders to debase and denigrate the country's institutions, including Parliament. He says if a significant number of lawmakers in Parliament turn out to be lawbreakers, then we as a nation should take responsibility as accomplices to the wrongdoing. He is all too familiar with the show. Political analyst Ralph Mathekga has penned an article about this dilemma, and he joins us now in studio to talk further. Good to see you, Ralph. Welcome.
Good morning, and good morning to your viewers.
Still using your pen as a weapon against these politicians, which, you know, and it has to happen. We've got to talk about these things.
Yeah, well, we can't get intimidated. We are the bosses of the politicians. We go out there and vote. And, you know, as citizenry, we've got the right to reflect on where we think we are. And we've got the right to reflect as to whether we're being led properly or not. And at this point, I'm actually disappointed when I look at Parliament. You know, when I wrote that article, actually, I was thinking about Parliament as a place where accountability starts, as the cornerstone of accountability. But then again, when I look at what is happening in Parliament, I look at the composition and I look at the manner in which Parliament sometimes reflect on these issues of integrity, investigations that ought to take place. You know, I'm left with a somber feeling that says that, wait a minute, not very much seems to be happening. And the reason is not because people are technically incompetent in Parliament, but it's simply because people are implicated. It's simply because people have got vested interest in the issues that they are ought to actually investigate. And for me, I'm reverting back to South African citizenry to say that, is this your idea of how Parliament ought to look like? Yeah. Did you vote for people who are not going to look into some investigations because they are implicated? I mean, what is this? I mean, we've got to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is this? What is the central concern of most in Parliament when they wake up? Yeah. Is it to protect themselves, or is it to work to the interest of all?
And as you are looking at it right now, I mean, just to answer your question, is it to protect themselves or is it to protect South Africans? Well, as you pen in your article, it is to protect themselves. And the reality is that this particular scandal, and let's talk to the VBS scandal, this affects a wide variety of people that are currently sitting and serving in Parliament.
I mean, if you ask the governing party and some opposition parties, they might be united in their resistance to a meaningful investigation into this. I mean, the ANC in Limpopo, where VBS is supposed to be based, there are allegations of people having benefited from that, and another opposition party, the Economic Freedom Fighters as well, there are allegations there that they are being implicated. And I mean, for me, when I look at the responses that have been put forward, and I'm not presuming guilt on the part of those who are facing allegations, but sometimes when I look at the responses, I don't feel dignified as a voter that, is this the response that I deserve? When such serious allegations are being raised on a factual matter, the fact is that VBS collapsed. The fact is that VBS has been looted by those who have been close to power. And the response that you get, it cannot be that, oh, these are just propaganda by the so-called white media and so forth, and recalcitrant analysts and so forth. As a voter, I want to say to the party, remember, nobody knows which party I voted for. Yeah. It might be the case that I voted for one of the parties that actually is implicated, but this is the beauty of democracy. I deserve better answers, and the answers that are coming out are not adequate. You can't just say that this is conspiracy and you continue, and particularly if the people who are implicated are in Parliament. So what that means is that now you have an opportunity here where Parliament could actually be used against people. What does that mean? People lost money in VBS, and secondly, as the taxpayers, we might be involved in subsidizing obstruction in Parliament because we are paying members of Parliament who seems not to be willing to do the job, some of whom seems to be willing to obstruct this process. And I'm not saying they are guilty, but I'm saying they are in a very untenable position because of the allegations that they're involved. It's making it very difficult for them to do their job, and it's quite sad.
It certainly is, and let's also talk to the DA, because the DA also are finding themselves in a position where we can call into question the DA's mayors. I mean, we look at Tshwane, we look at what's happening in Johannesburg respectively as well. I mean, we just had the mayor sitting here, in fact, in the chair talking to us. But they take a big stance against wrongdoing. However, you've now got the DA leader, Musi Maimane, that's involved in a housing scandal where he now is apparently renting a house from a businessman under very hazy terms. But he's been shouting out to Julius Malema from the EFF for doing pretty much so the exact same thing. I mean, where do we go from here?
It's very disappointing because it says that there is a fundamental belief among our politicians that they need to get things for free. I mean, they can afford houses, these people.
Yeah.
These people earn in the range of over 800,000 per annum. That's a way above the average pay in South Africa, and they continue to receive this. And when we ask questions, under what conditions are you living in this house? They want us to believe that, oh, it's because they are loved by these business people who happen to be supporting them. There is no acknowledgement that this is building a strong perception that in them doing their work in Parliament, they will then have to look into the interest of those businessmen. Mr. Maimane as well is caught in this. And again, I've been very openly critical of the coalitions that have been entered into between the DA and the EFF in the city of Johannesburg. I've actually used the term, how do they lubricate those coalitions? Is it because of the exchange of patronage? Because when I look at these two parties, there is nothing that brings them together. And reports are surfacing about tender irregularities, allegations of tender irregularities in Tshwane and also in the city of Johannesburg. And this is where the DA is trying to say, oh, look at us, we want to showcase what we will do at national government level. All that says now is that the reason why the DA comes out as the least corrupt party, it might not be because the party is fundamentally not against corruption, but it might just be because the party is not fully in government. Yeah. What will happen if they are fully exposed in government? Given some of what we are seeing here, I really have doubts if corruption is actually seen as a problem here. I don't think we have a moral position, Leanne, against corruption. I've got a feeling that as a nation, what we've been expressing so far is the inconvenience against corruption. The inconvenience is when someone has not picked up the garbage can and it's stinking, and I start asking, oh, who has got the tender? But the moral basis of corruption is when someone shows up with a Range Rover. I want to know, how did you purchase it? How does that relate to your own income? And so they can never be. We don't live in a magic world, yeah? I can explain fully how I earn my income to pay for all that I have. It cannot be that our politicians want to live like business people while they keep on saying they are serving us.
Servants of the people.
That's hypocrisy.
That's pretty much what it should be. I want to talk about one aspect that you write about, and this really scares me, because I know that corruption happens all over the world. We are not immune to it. I mean, we could just see what's happening in America and the allegations against Donald Trump and his relationship with different people. And so it happens everywhere. However, you talk about a conference that you recently attended at Stellenbosch University, and there was a Ghanaian professor who actually brought up the concept of mockingly said, why don't African countries just democratize corruption? Because it's so rife, happens all over the place, so go for it, do that. Is it really, is it that bad? Are we that far gone?
Oh, I mean, that's how desperate it is. Even some of the states that, if you read in academia, in the Southern Africa, you always hear that Botswana is one of the most clean government. There is massive corruption in Botswana. It's not even an open democracy. I speak openly about these things. I've been critical of Rwanda, which is being seen now as the Singapore of Africa. I have been to Rwanda. I've spent a month in Rwanda. I've spoken to people. I read a lot. I engage with the people that side, and I know some of them have responded to my writings. And I've taken a position to say that, you know what, in some of those countries where we tend to believe there is a lack of corruption, is because you don't find an open society. So what that means is that if you can have a little bit of dictatorship within your system, like you have in Rwanda, because I call it a semi-dictatorship, not an open society. The constitution has been changed for Mr. Kagame to continue. People can debate whether is this an African model of democracy, that's fine. But the reality is that there is corruption within that. So you really struggle to find some of the states that don't have corruption. And that is why people are desperately saying that maybe are we going to win on this, or maybe should we just accept that part of the development of a post-colonial state in Africa, it is to pass through corruption. I thought in South Africa we could do it differently, and I don't mean to say we are exceptional, but I thought that with the civil society that is in existence, the vibrant communities, and also knowing the historical legacy that we cannot waste time on corruption, given the fact that we have to redistribute for the historically disadvantaged. I thought we could do it differently, but what is happening in South Africa, you just see different levels. Past few years, we have had really massive corruption in the public and the private sector. You are Steinhoffs and so forth. But again, the society is not actually voting along that. And people are asking, maybe, is that a problem? Maybe is corruption the way to redistribute? Are the new comrades finding it a way, you know, are they engaged in corruption simply because there are no proper institutions to redistribute? I understand all this frustration, Leanne, but we cannot democratize corruption. We can do it better. I think we can get things better in South Africa.
Quick question: xenophobia.
Yeah.
We've seen these recent attacks taking place in the country. I mean, we had in the first hour of the program, we had the taxi industry talking to also some of the issues that they see with regard to drug peddling. The whole idea of what started these xenophobic attacks, or criminality, because that's what the government is calling it. What do you make of this? Is this a desperate nation saying there are no opportunities for us? We're fighting for jobs, we're fighting for survival at this point. What do you read into it?
You know, I'll tell you, one of the political analysts mentioned that, political writer mentioned that actually democracy, the greatest risk that democracy has is like in poor countries. Democracy doesn't survive well in poor countries. The greatest risk is that we are a democratic nation, but we seem not to be distributing opportunities at the center of our democracy. People are unemployed. People are becoming desperate. And what happens? People tend to disengage when you are having this kind of a system at the center where you have high unemployment. And when people disengage, they become susceptible to things such as mobilization, such as xenophobia. Some of the protests that we say are service delivery, of course, some are service delivery, and some are just mobilized by people who are just contesting for leadership. So, at the center of this is that the crisis of legitimacy within political leadership in the country is responsible for all this. That is why politicians cannot easily stand tall and say to people that we are addressing your concerns. Stop what you are doing. Politicians have lost legitimacy to actually strike a rapport with the broader nation. They have to work on that legitimacy. How do you work on that legitimacy? You stop corruption. You behave in a manner that shows that you are morally upstanding.
All right, Ralph, thank you. Thanks so much for talking to us here on the program. That's Ralph Mathekga talking to us about corruption in South Africa, and particularly with regard to our politicians and normalizing corruption, in fact democratizing it. And that is a very big issue that we cannot allow to happen. So thanks again for that.